Alex is a physician, a former assistant professor of medicine, director of primary care, and assistant vice president for student health and counseling service at the University of Chicago. He currently leads, and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, he currently leads a direct primary care private practice called Imagine MD. Is that right? In
That's
Chicago.
right.
Cool.
That's right.
Alex has extensive experience treating the sickest of the sick in the most compassionate manner possible at an international renowned academic medical center located in the heart of one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. Very cool. His first book, and the reason I have him on the podcast today, is called The Undefeated Mind, on the science of constructing an indestructible self, published in 2012. And he's received numerous favorable reviews from many sources, including Publishers Weekly. Alex has been quoted in Crane's Chicago Business, Playboy, the Chicago Tribune, Men's Health, New York Times, and Time Magazine. Has articles appeared in Psychology Today, Crane's Chicago Business, USA Today, Slate, Huffington Post, Counselor Magazine, and Medicine in the Midway. Wow. He's also been a guest on NPR's On Point. Alex, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
How did I do?
Awesome. That was perfect. Okay. You made me sound much better than I am.
Okay. Alex, man, it's so good to have you on the show. So we're talking to you in Chicago, right?
I am in Chicago.
So tell us, you're actively you're a physician now, and your focus is primary care, right?
That's right. That's right. So I'm practicing in a new model of care called direct primary care, excuse me, or it's also known as Concierge Medicine. It's something that I left the University of Chicago after being there for 20 years to do, because after 20 years of practicing medicine in a fee-for-service environment, I kind of decided I wanted to be able to practice medicine differently. It's no secret, I think, that medicine is in many ways broken, and part of that breakage is due to the absolute deluge of patients that each doctor is required to take care of. And I wanted to change that so I could spend more time with each patient and actually, frankly, talk about a lot of the things I talk about in my book with my patients, which in a fee-for-service environment, I just don't have the time to do. So now in direct primary care, my new patient appointments are 2 hours long. My return appointments are an hour long. My schedule is no longer the rate-limiting step in how much time and focus I can put into each patient.
So that's cool. And that's something, we were chatting before I hit the record button that we didn't talk about. But so concierge, does that mean you're like kind of on call? Like somebody can call you and they have more access to you. Is that right?
That's right.
And I'm paying outside of the insurance model.
That's right. You're paying a membership fee. And so my fee is $135 a month, and I don't charge anything else. So whether you come and see me once a year or once a week, it's the same fee. I didn't want to disincentivize anyone from coming to see me when they needed to by requiring them to have a copay because I was billing their insurance.
Okay.
And that enables me to do, that's the secret sauce. It gives me the ability to shrink my panel size. So in the middle of the night, when you call our number, you get me. And I, the doctor who knows you the best and can sort of help figure out what's wrong the most efficiently, the cheapest, and and provide the best quality outcome.
This is kind of harkening back to the days of old, right, where doctors kind of made visits and house visits and what have you, right? Or there was a little more access.
That's the idea. I mean, it's our health is so important. We just content ourselves with the fact that we have such crappy customer service and that there's so much delay in access because we don't seem to feel there's any other option. But when I discovered this model, I thought, here's the option we kind of all need. And if I really actually think this is one of the solutions to solving a large part of what's wrong with the medical system. So I'm hoping it expands because I think certainly my patients love it. The ones who value the service enough to pay that slight extra money, but when you look at how much money people are paying for insurance, it's a drop in the bucket, and yet the service they get in response to that is really dramatically different.
So, I didn't want to make this podcast about that, but is this? Do you think this is where healthcare is going, or has to go, or
I think it has to. I mean,
is this growing? Do you see it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. In fact, if you look at sort of online Google searches for things like concierge medicine, direct primary care, it's explosive. And currently, there are not enough direct primary care doctors out there to actually meet the demand of people who are just fed up with their inability to access their doctors in the traditional fee-for-service system. So I think of this the way I think of cable TV. You probably, like me, remember when cable TV hit, and at first people were sort of thinking, well, wait, why would I pay for this when I have free television and I can watch things there? And now we're in a post-cable TV world almost. So I think it is going to hit because it is a viable, an excellent solution to a real problem so many people have right now, which is the inability to access the medical system in a way that serves them well and doesn't frustrate them.
It's very interesting. I need to talk to you more about that. That's very interesting. Sure. But just for our audience, are you taking more patients, or you're?
Oh, I am okay. Indeed. No, absolutely. Yeah. In Chicago, if you're in the Chicago area, absolutely. I'm looking to bring people on for sure, and then ultimately expand even beyond Chicago.
Okay, cool. But the reason we have you on the podcast is your book, but that's yes. Very interesting. And I was telling you again before we started is that, I'm a big reader. Books are kind of, if you look at my library, and I'm talking about, I have probably more Kindle digital books now than I have, hardcovers, but I still have a lot of hardcovers that I've kept. And the reason I've kept them, they're all marked up, right? And I still go back. I'll go back and say, I think there was something here in this book, and I can find the highlight. But you can kind of look at my life. I can kind of look at my life and actually walk somebody through the periods of my life based on these books, right? Either I'm learning something, I'm in transition, or I'm dealing with something, right? That I need more information about. And I read your book, The Undefeated Mind, and it was very interesting because some of the information is kind of paradoxical. It was one of those which I will classify as self-improvement, but that's a poor, or self-help. That's a poor classification. But outside of that, it was one of those books where, because I like more scientific research based, and or I'll look at the author to see, is this somebody in the medical profession or the psychological profession or research, that type of thing. It was one of those books where, and we're going to get into in a second, where it wasn't airy-fairy, if you know what I mean. It was hard. There was hard reality, and you didn't bypass it. And I recommend everybody read this book, but you addressed it and said, here's my take on dealing with this, either tragedy or the difficulty or what have you. And that's what this podcast is about, is like, how do we either deal with things that are setbacks, or how do we prepare for that? Because that's pretty much a lot of what life is. And I think your book did this very well. So tell me, how did you come to write the book, first of all?
Sure. And I appreciate your comments. I have a bit of an allergy to the term self-help, and I like the idea of science help more. And there's a lot of books out there where people purport to have answers to how to solve life's problems. And I wanted to write a book that took all the wisdom I hopefully have accumulated over 20 years of medical practice and reading about the actual research in the field, and I wanted to distill that advice in a practical, able to use a practical manner where people could actually use it, but also base it on research and science, and also call out where the research is not clear and it's not really obvious what the right thing to do is. So how I came to write the book is that I remember one day in clinic, I was seeing a patient who had, as his chief complaint, a runny nose. And what was striking about his runny nose was not that he had a runny nose, but more that it had really stopped his life in its tracks. And he started talking about all the ways in which he was suffering over this runny nose. And part of me was sort of trying not to sort of chuckle at what he was saying. Part of me was also empathizing, because I also have allergies and a runny nose, but I was just really struck by how, while on the surface he had this very minor problem, the degree of disruption to his life was really significant. And the very next patient I saw was a woman who had been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer and who was literally dying. And she was the picture of equipoise. she had somehow come to a place of acceptance about her diagnosis that, I mean, frankly, was luminous to me. And we spent our time talking about what she wanted to do with the remainder of her time left. And I was, I was very moved by her attitude and her life condition in the face of this really dramatic diagnosis. And at the end of the clinic, I remember thinking to myself, one, how striking it was that these two patients who I saw, one right after the other, were having the exact opposite responses to their actual circumstances than you would expect. And it got me thinking about what is it that makes people resilient and what is it that makes people fragile. And like many characteristics that obviously have some degree of genetic components to them, and I think resilience is no different. There's this range that we seem to be born with. Why is it some people are able to consistently operate in the upper end of that range? And so no matter what happens to them, they remain joyful and optimistic. And other people, the smallest thing happens to them and their days are ruined. And I got interested in this partly because as a practicing Buddhist at the time, the core tenet of the philosophy of the type of Buddhism I practice is that to be happy, you must be strong. That inner strength really is the key. And I got very interested to find out, was there research that suggested that the accumulated wisdom from 2,500 years of Buddhist thinking and philosophy actually had support in modern day science. And it turned out there'd been an explosion of science in the last 2 decades that supported a lot of these 2,500-year-old ideas. And I wanted to share those ideas in an organized way and in a practical way that translated the conversations I was having with my patients on a regular basis into I wanted to put those ideas in one place where I could point people and say, here is my best thinking about how you can maintain and establish resilience in your own life.
So that's great, because I want to touch on the Buddhism part. So you practice Nichiren. Am I saying that correct? Nichiren
That's right. It's Nichiren Buddhism. Yes.
Prior to your book, I'd never heard of that type of Buddhism. But then I did some Google search prior to the interview, and there's a lot of information out there. Tell us about Nichiren Buddhism. What is it's chanting?
Sure.
Right?
Sure, yeah. So I should qualify this by saying I really am first and foremost a scientist. And so though my Buddhist friends would probably be horrified to hear me say this, I really reject the mysticism, the mystical aspect of the practice. But I find the philosophy and the practice itself extraordinarily valuable. In fact, you could argue modern day cognitive behavioral therapy is founded on Buddhist principles, because Buddhist principles in general, whatever sect you're talking about, really have a lot to do with observing one's own mind, one's own thought processes. And now there's a ton of science supporting the benefits of meditation, which really are quite separate, I think, both in the mechanism by which they work and the effect they have from chanting a mantra, which is indeed what Nichiren Buddhism is about. And so in Nichiren Buddhism, practitioners chant the mantra Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and they will argue that this is the name of the mystic law, which is in some way the essence of the universe's, the life of the universe, and therefore the life of individual human beings, which they take to be identical. So I don't really subscribe to that view, but I will tell you, after 20 plus years of actually practicing chanting that mantra, there was an enormous frequency or confluence of wisdom that chanting brought out of me. And I have theories about why that is, which are quite a bit different from what the Buddhists will tell you. I think there's got to be some scientifically validatable and identifiable principle by which it works. And my sense is this: if you imagine, as a writer, it's very obvious to me that when I sit down to write, and often I'll get blocked and be unable to move forward, and I'll try, and I'm scrambling with my conscious mind to sort of figure out the way forward. And it's only sometimes when I get away from it and I'm not thinking about it and my conscious mind is sort of drifting free that suddenly a spark of an idea that comes from nowhere will leap out of nowhere, and suddenly I see the way forward. Sort of the idea is, where do creative ideas come from? Well, we have no idea. We use words like they come from our unconscious mind, and they're clearly coming from somewhere within us, but the idea that we are the author of our own ideas and our own thoughts is to some degree an illusion. What I have found is that over the years, by chanting, it seems to give me greater access to my creative mind and to creative ideas that are not necessarily ideas that have been flowing logically in a sequence from one to the next, like a math problem, but more creative ideas that when I chant about a particular problem, whether that problem is how to move forward in a story I'm writing or a piece of writing I'm working on, or a problem in my life, that the wisdom to advance and to break through those obstacles does indeed seem to exist somewhere within me. And often it is, this sudden insight, this creative insight that enables me to leap forward. And I write about some of these episodes in the book that really did happen and were somewhat inscrutable and difficult to understand. But I think that there is a process that mantra chanting in some way distracts the conscious mind, the part of the mind that thinks very logically, very orderly, which studies have clearly shown inhibit more creative thinking. And, it's a different mode of thinking. And so my current thinking about this, and I don't know that this is right, but my current thinking about this is that through chanting, you are, in a sense, increasing the access to your creative powers and the wisdom you have to solve problems in ways that you are not thinking about or maybe even unwilling to think about. So if you think about how do people break through problems that they keep coming up against over and over and over again in their lives because they keep making the same mistakes? And part of it is because the solutions that they're willing to enact to solve a particular problem are very narrow. And maybe they're afraid of trying other things, or the other things that they might try are so overwhelming to contemplate because they invoke such intense negative emotions, fear, for example, that they're unwilling to even consider these other solutions as real solutions. In some sense, wisdom ends up being opening your mind to those solutions that you have been close to and discovering that, in fact, the real solution has been sitting there all along. You've just been too afraid to take it.
I'm trying to break this down, right, to see how do we use it. Do you think meditation generally does what you're saying, whether it's chanting or focusing on the breath or just being silent? In other words, kind of turning off that conscious part of the mind.
I don't, actually. Okay. I think they do different things.
All right.
I think because I've meditated as well, and I think and the effects of meditation of learning.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
You're making a difference between meditation and chanting. Is that right?
I am.
Oh, okay.
I am.
Okay, because I was conflated. All right. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think they're quite different. And again, make sure you understand this is my personal anecdotal view. I don't have any data to support this, but it's my experience because I've done both, and the effects seem to be different. And I'll say chanting has not been studied nearly as to the degree that meditation has currently. But meditation, it does things like bring people greater control over their emotions. It actually enhances their executive function to some degree. It actually teaches them to focus their attention, live more in the moment. It reduces anxiety, has an effect on the emotions. I have not seen studies, nor have I had the experience by meditation that it enhances creative thinking or necessarily leads me to help figure out how to solve problems. That's what chanting has done for me.
Got it.
Which is equally valuable, but I think different.
Hey, it's Larry. Real quickly, I just wanted to interject something here to provide some context on my discussion with Alex. Alex's book is about how someone can springboard from adversity into strength. And it is packed, in my opinion, with that type of wisdom. It's a great book. I just wanted to interject on and provide some context on the discussion of Nichiren Buddhism and meditation, because Alex credits in his book Nichiren Buddhism, and specifically its practice of chanting, which incorporates the phrase Nam-myo Rinkyokyo over and over again, for some insights he gets, wisdom, helping him overcome challenges. And my inquiry in our conversation is due to my interest in anything that might be working for someone, but more, and my interest in meditation specifically, and Buddhism in general, even though I'm not a Buddhist. And Alex points out that the practice of Nichiren Buddhism doesn't involve meditation. And I was confusing the two, or thought that it was a form of meditation. And it may be, but according to Alex, it's really not, as it relates to, let's say, mindfulness or centering. So that was the back and forth. Alex chants the phrase Namyo Rinkyokyo, and you could actually Google this and hear how it sounds. I do think it's interesting, the studies that are coming out around unconscious processes, and we're all familiar with it. Sleep on it, singing in the shower, activities like that either distracts or maybe focuses the mind, and it can often free it to do some work of discovery, connecting the dots or problem solving. There is something about a mix of engagement and repetitive monotony that can trigger insight. Psychologists call it the default mode network. So that was the context and is the context around our conversation and the back and forth. I just wanted to kind of highlight that and encourage and push you toward the book, encourage you to get the book and read it because it's very, very interesting. All right, let's get back to it.
Is that what you mean by creativity?
Yeah. So
you're
putting
actually a problem on the back burner and then chanting, all of a sudden you get some insight. Okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, in fact, this is partly what I'm talking about in the book I'm currently writing, which is that there's a difference between understanding something with your mind, your head, and understanding it with in Western society, with your heart. In Buddhism, they say with your life, meaning it is wisdom that is active in your life. So you don't just understand, for example, you should quit smoking. You suddenly are in a place where you are making an attempt to quit smoking and are quitting smoking because you understand with your life, for example, that to continue smoking is going to kill you, as opposed to understanding it theoretically and saying, yeah, I should quit, but I'm really not ready to do that. So in one sense, you could argue wisdom is action, right? You can't be said to be wise about a particular thing unless you are behaving in accordance with the principle you are espousing. And so the idea for me is when I've chanted and I've wanted to solve problems, and I'm banging my head against a particular problem, what I have found is there's a difference between understanding intellectually, this is what I should do, and suddenly being in a place where I get it so much that I go, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to approach this. So I have dramatically improved relationships with this. I've dramatically improved anxieties with this by coming to a sudden understanding that is completely different from the thought process I had even a moment before, and understanding that somehow seems to penetrate my life and actually change me in a way. And so I think understanding occurs at different levels. And what I've learned is just by chanting and sort of really challenging problems with this, with the attitude of I am responsible for solving this problem. I need to understand what I can do about this particular issue, whatever it happens to be. When I have done that, I can't explain it, but answers have come, and not just intellectual answers, but changes in the way I feel, changes in the way I find myself behaving. I documented some of that. And the mechanics of it are, I'm chanting that phrase, but I am sitting there thinking to myself, I'm not actually trying to clear my mind, focus on the moment of my breath. What I'm actually thinking about is a very particular problem I'm trying to solve. And the image I have often in my mind is I'm a sprinter lining up at a starting block, getting ready to run the race of my life. And I'm sitting there thinking, I have this problem, which is the race, and I've got to run it. So I am demanding of myself and promising myself that I'm going to find some way, some piece of wisdom that's going to enable me to solve the problem that I currently don't know how to solve. It's almost as if I'm speaking to the part of myself where wisdom is contained and saying to it, you're going to give me the answer. And I can't exactly say why in different times the answer has appeared when it did, but it's happened enough times that I don't think it's a coincidence. I think there's something about that process that does open up that wise part of us that gives me answers that once I see them, like, oh my God, this has been so obvious. How could I not have seen this before? But it's not just seeing it, it's the way you see it. Here's an analogy for you, which I've actually found to be also a literal thing. There's some evidence, when people talk about this, when you're in the shower, a lot of creative ideas come to you, or when you're out walking. I find, for example, when I'm swinging a bat, if I'm really stuck and I start swinging a bat, that the act of doing that, I feel as if I'm distracting some part of my mind, perhaps my rational executive function, moving it out of the way. And I think chanting does the same thing. That's been my experience. And so you move it out of the way, and suddenly you have a more direct line into sort of the creative parts of you that don't necessarily think logically, if A, then B, then C, but suddenly insight that, to me, what's really astounding about this is that the insight has anything to do with what problem I'm trying to solve, but it does. So I've used it when I've been stuck in writing. I've used it when I've been stuck in life as a way of sort of literally swinging a bat to sort of distract myself.
Well, look, we want to expose people on the podcast to various technologies that have worked for other people, right? And
sure,
I've got a cush ball I'm looking at right across here that I play with. I'll stand up and I'll just shake that cush ball.
Yeah.
While I'm thinking about a problem.
That's right. There are studies that suggest when you distract yourself in certain ways that way, you actually, different parts of the brain become activated, the creative parts of the brain that bring out these sudden insights, which really are, in one sense, they are quieted when you're in an analytical mode. Those creative parts are quieter. It's sort of an either or. And so for me, chanting, there's nothing magical or mystical about it. It seems to quiet my rational analytical part and give me better access to my creative part. And so in one sense, I don't want to make it too big a deal out of what this is. It's just another technique for doing that.
But this is cool. Yeah. And but you're, because I tried it like before so I took that phrase. Super. I felt weird. I felt but I didn't separate so I was trying to separate. There is some mysticism to it, right? I think. Is there a tradition of that? Because
huge, yeah.
Okay, because I didn't want that, but I was like trying it. I should have tried it after I talked to you now, because now I've got a better understanding. Because I was like,
it's unusual to talk about this divorced from the mysticism of it, and I'm not. I was very open initially when I started practicing 21 years ago. Or longer, actually, to the notion of it, of the possibility of mysticism. But 20 years of thinking and reflecting and experiencing, I really reject mysticism. I'm a very empirical, scientific thinker, and I'll believe any wacky thing you want to tell me if there's evidence to support it. And while my own experience is the evidence that tells me this works, that doesn't tell me how it works. And I've seen nothing to convince me that this works because Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is actually the name of the mystic law. I think that's frankly a nonsensical statement. But that doesn't mean I reject a practical tool that has had very real, or provided me with very real benefit. That's sort of how I'd sum up my interaction with this.
It's great. And, are there resources that are less mysticism focused out there that you know of that we can point to? At the end of this, I'll write it up and we'll have resources. Think about it. I don't know if there are, but,
yeah, there's one. It's hard to find anything written about this that does not also embrace the mystical aspect. But if you're coming at it with recognizing that you can separate the two, I think there is a resource I could recommend for your listeners at the end. We can go through that.
Is the Soka Gakkai, that organization, is that kind of more of a church type of thing?
The Soka Gakkai is the lay organization of Buddhists, and they're very much about, it's a wonderful organization in many senses, that it's an organization really dedicated towards the establishment of world peace through the accomplishment of individual happiness. But that organization as a whole really embraces the mystical aspects of things.
Yeah, that's where I felt uncomfortable as I was looking at it. I'm like, I don't know. But yes. So let's get into the book, The Undefeated Mind. I love this snippet, basically where you state, the book exhorts us to stop hoping for easy lives and instead to focus on cultivating the inner strength we need to enjoy the difficult lives we all have. The reason I like that is because it acknowledges the reality, as we talked about before, and dealing with what is. Does that make sense? Which to me, that's the pragmatic part of, look, I've got to face difficult work, problems, sickness, and that's the real world. How do we, give me some galoshes to get through that, right?
Well, I think that's exactly. I mean, I wanted to. You can't begin to solve a problem until you identify what the problem is, and if your answer is, happy life, you have to sort of run from problems. That never works. That's just there are a lot of people who try that strategy and they end up miserable. So I wanted to call attention to the fact that there are no easy answers, and we have to begin with the truth, which is that life is difficult, and what do we do about it? And in fact, the idea that you could be happy in the midst of a difficult life is a core principle of the philosophy of Buddhism, and it's also a core principle of psychology, that people just have this idea now that we should only ever feel good. And that idea and clinging to that idea is itself the source of a great amount of misery in our world today.
Yeah. So especially in your day-to-day life, right? Your lives are filled with misfortune and sickness, and that's what you deal with, right? But you say that misfortune frequently adds up only to lives filled with suffering. But to build strength out of adversity, we need a catalyst. What do you mean by that? What is the catalyst?
Well, the catalyst is wisdom. And I think, there's this notion, Nietzsche has the famous quote, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger." But it turns out that's only true if what doesn't kill you imparts wisdom. If you don't learn anything from it, it doesn't actually make you stronger. It just makes you suffer. And you just get through it and learn nothing, and you're no better prepared to deal with the next obstacle coming your way than you were with the one that just left you and perhaps crushed you. So the notion that just because you go through difficulty means you're going to grow and learn and become wiser is not true. I know many people who go through difficulties who learn nothing, and they're no better prepared to handle the same difficulty coming up again than they were the first time. So I think that catalyst is within us, the ability to learn from our mistakes and figure out how to approach problems differently, to come to a better outcome, to end suffering more quickly, or to actually elevate our baseline level of happiness. That is what I consider to be wisdom. And you can, I think there are a number of particular attitudes and qualities that make it more likely you will learn wisdom from adversity. And that's partly what I wrote the book about, was to sort of help you figure out how should you best seek to learn from the obstacles that you're faced with, so that you are better able to withstand them next time around.
Right. So tell us, what is the attitude embracing or welcoming either the setback, the challenge, the obstacle, taking that attitude of, if it doesn't kill me, I'll learn something from it. Yeah, and I'm oversimplifying, right? You talk about some of the benefits where you had failed. I don't know if it was a test or medical board or what have you, but you had struggled, and then there was an opportunity that came up in your life where you were able to use that experience to help someone else.
Yeah, there's this wonderful phrase and concept in Buddhism called turning poison into medicine. And what the concept basically means is that everything that happens to us has within it the potential to provide us a benefit, a great benefit. Now, that doesn't mean, people like to think in very black and white terms that, it's no longer this terrible thing that happened to me, now it's this wonderful benefit. That's not really the case. If you imagine the worst possible tragedy that we can imagine happening to us in general, most people would agree it's that when a parent loses a child. And the notion that you could turn that poison into medicine, some people are offended by that. The notion that you could ever create a benefit out of losing a child seems in some way to diminish the significance of your loss. But that's just not the way it actually works. If you survey and look at surveys of parents who've actually lost children, it turns out they do gain benefits from that loss. In fact, I quote the statistic in the book, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like 60% of parents who actually lost children found that as a result of that loss, they were more courageous. And some 40% found that as a result of the loss, they became closer to their surviving children. So these are very real, tangible benefits that would not have occurred had the loss itself not occurred. Now, none of those parents would say necessarily, I'm glad that loss occurred, or the benefit was worth the loss that I gained. But even the worst tragedy imaginable, there are benefits that can accrue. We tend to think very black and white that there aren't. It's only all bad or only all good. That's just not the way it really is in life. And so to some degree, the way you navigate through losses like that is just where you put your attention. And so if you spend your time only focusing on the loss, that's what is then in your mind. That's what you are mindful of. But if you focus your attention more on what benefits you really did get, if you first open your mind to the notion there could have been a benefit, and then you actually focus on it, that can, to some degree, transform the meaning of that loss. It doesn't necessarily help you with the process of getting over that loss. That's a very particular process that has a time course to it and a natural rhythm to it. But I'll give you an example. So this is actually one of the techniques when after I'd written the book at the University of Chicago, I turned that book into a curriculum called the Resilience Project. And one of the principles we taught was how one deals with loss. An incredible loss like that, and the practice, the exercise that we put those students through was the following. We actually had them sit down with a piece of paper and write at the top of that piece of paper a loss that they had suffered in the past. And it was important that it had to be far enough back. They were over it to some degree, or if not over it, they had processed it to some degree, so they had some perspective. And then we said to them, we want you to write down, as you think about it, benefit that arose from that loss, not benefit you wanted to get or benefit you thought you should have gotten, but actually over time, benefit you discovered you got. And what was interesting about this exercise was a couple things. One is when you are forced to write it down, you actually often find yourself discovering an idea at the moment you're writing it. The process of writing itself again, brings out that creative, ideas that you weren't necessarily thinking of the moment before you wrote them. And a number of people who went through that exercise, and others who, since that time I've taken this exercise around the country at various workshops I've given, will say at the end of that workshop, I really never thought about the benefit I got from, say, having my father pass away. But in fact, this is a real benefit. And now that I'm realizing that, the way I think about my father's loss has changed. It's not that I don't grieve his loss. It's not that I don't miss him. I'm not sad. But now I genuinely feel there is some positive benefit that accrued to my life that I can actually feel good about. And it does, over time, temper the way you feel about that, the way you think about that experience and how it affects you. And then it becomes really a matter of, what do you focus on? Do you focus on the loss that you've suffered and how much that's taken from you, or do you choose to focus on what you've benefited from it and sort of then maybe even use that loss with that benefit in the future to give benefit to other people?
Do they struggle? Have you found your students to struggle with guilt to say, I can't pull a benefit out of this tragedy because it makes it seem like it's justified in some way? I mean,
yes, that is an obstacle. In fact, I think a lot of times people cling to the pain of loss itself longer than they need to, because that remains the only thing connecting them to the person, for example, they have lost. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense of guilt, as if to say, to get over this loss, in some sense, diminishes the importance of this relationship to me. And I think that with that circumstance, you simply have to confront that idea and remind yourself that's not the case, that to stop your suffering over the loss of someone you loved does not indicate that you didn't love them as much as you think you did. It is not natural for us to continue to suffer, and no one who loves us, of course, would want us to continue to suffer to the degree that our lives have stopped over, a loss. I wouldn't want any of my loved ones, when I die, to live their lives miserable because I'm not in them. I'd want them to get over me. Always, I'd want them to remember me, and I'd want them to think fondly of me, and hopefully whatever positive impact I'd had in their lives would continue forward. But I don't like the idea of them, suffering simply because I'm gone. So, and I wouldn't feel, if I were somehow to be able, to look down from, say, heaven, that since they gotten over me, that meant our relationship wasn't as real or as important to them as I thought it was. Mm-hmm. I think you just have to confront that notion in yourself.
Yeah. What have you learned from the loss? How has your heart grown? I've used kind of that technique, just not with tragedies, but with just trying to figure out what's good about this. In other words, something bad. What could be good? What could be good? I try to ask myself a different question. What could be good about this? And list them. And then it tends to take the sting away. It tends to give me a different perspective, right?
Well, there are people who have built an entire life and career on tragic losses they've had. I don't remember his name, but there was a show on, I think, in the 90s, Adam, I can't remember. There's a father whose son was brutally murdered, and as a result from that, he made a determination.
Yes,
I don't either, but he created a program like America's Most Wanted, something like that.
Yes,
where they, as a result of that show, they tracked down and caught hundreds of other murderers in the country, all
TV
driven
movie,
by
about his loss of his son.
Right. I mean, it was this horrible tragedy that then he turned into incredible value. And in a smaller way, the example you started this line of questioning with from my book was where basically, as a result of sort of becoming depressed in my second year of medical school over the breakup of my first girlfriend, I failed part one of the national board exam. And to me, this was the worst possible thing that could have happened to me. I didn't think I was going to graduate medical school. It was risking my entire career. And so I instead of sort of wallowing in self-pity and suffering, I decided, okay, it took a while, but I said, all right, I'm just going to have to take it again. And so for my entire third year medical school, I wasn't just sort of attending medical school. I was also studying to retake this test. And I did it and I passed it. And then years later, when I was an attending physician at the University of Chicago, where I was for 20 years, I remember a student coming to me who had experienced the same thing. She had failed the boards. And only because I'd had that experience myself was I able to understand exactly what she was feeling, tell her the story, and encourage her that if I could do it, she could do it too. And so I, in a very real way, turned the poison of that experience into medicine by actually
And two people were rewarded. Two people were rewarded.
That's right. That's right.
You helped her, and you felt good helping someone else.
I did.
Right? Or
I did.
Enlarged.
Absolutely right. And in fact, the benefit didn't even end there. As a result of having to study all that extra year, I really think, and I can actually point to very specific instances where it really has made me a better doctor. It's very clear to me that had that experience not happened to me, the thought process I now go through, the way I approach certain medical problems would be different. And by different, I mean inferior.
Yeah, there's a book called, you probably read it, called The Survivor Personality. A guy named Al Siebert talked about that people seldom learn to tap into their deepest strengths and abilities until they're forced to do so by some kind of major adversity, right?
Yes. Is you don't know how strong you are until you are forced to pull out and lift a heavy weight.
Yeah. And sometimes the terrible experiences of our lives may become our redemption, or, just, we don't know. Right.
That's right.
You state, this is very good, but you state that we have an endowed purpose. No, we don't have an endowed purpose, but rather an evolved function. And you said that evolved function is to be happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm an atheist. I don't believe that there's a God or a universe that has sort of said to us or assigned us some higher purpose. I think the way we evolved to avoid pain and embrace pleasure sort of translated when we developed self-awareness and a higher intelligence into sort of the equivalence in that area of happiness and suffering. And I think that from the ancient Greeks on down, there's generally been agreement that the ultimate goal of human flourishing is happiness. And I think that, in fact, neurologically even and psychologically, therefore, we're unable to escape the drive to be happy. And that's really to what all our ends aim, and in fact, to all what our ends all should aim to, not just our happiness, but collective happiness.
But you think that supersedes survival and reproduction?
Well, I do. It's interesting you ask. I mean, I write about this very thing. In fact, I've had, admittedly, anecdotal experiences, but there are patients I've taken care of. So in the rare instances where people are forced to choose between continuing to survive and being happy, that if they're going to continue to survive, they're not going to be happy. They're going to suffer. Invariably, they choose not to continue to survive. I've had numerous terminal patients who were suffering greatly and actually made choices to end their lives sooner than they otherwise would have because they were so unhappy and saw no hope to be happy. Luckily, we don't mostly have to make those choices. We're not confronted with the choice either to continue living and be miserable or to end your life, because you can't be happy. I think when people are in a position where they are miserable, the reason they don't contemplate suicide immediately is because they continue to have hope that they won't always be miserable. But I do think ultimately, if you have to line up those two drives, that the drive to be happy is stronger in most people.
That's very interesting. So you actually think efforts should be oriented around happiness?
Well,
or no?
No, certainly. I mean, this gets down into a pragmatic question in medicine between quality and quantity of life. And, if you're like me, most of the people you talk to about end of life measures, or if certain things were to happen to them that would dramatically impair the quality of their lives, that they would no longer want to live. And what's interesting about this, it gets more complex, and we probably don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but how you imagine you would feel when terrible things happen to you is not often how you do feel once you get there. But when people really are faced with unending suffering that has pain, or terminal illnesses that significantly on their way to dying or on the way to death compromise the quality of their life, quality of life becomes what's paramount. That I've seen this again and again and again. I don't know if there's any studies that prove this, but it's certainly been my anecdotal experience with patients that most people are much more concerned with the quality of their lives than they are with the continued quantity of life.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole field in positive psychology. In fact, my wife's written a book on it, but there's this debate out there, I guess, where some people are saying, well, if you want to be happy, forget about being happy. Go do these other things. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Say,
I don't think
don't chase it, or it will run from you.
Right.
Other people are saying, well, wait a minute. Find out what makes you happy. Chase.
Yeah.
Try to achieve that.
I have. And interestingly, this is what my next book is about what is happiness and how does one get it. I think the idea of that, the harder you chase happiness, the more it will elude you, sounds like one of those wise things that really doesn't make any sense. I think, if you want to be happy, what's become clear to me is there are some very specific things you shouldn't do and some very specific things you should do. And if you don't do those things, no matter how much you're pretending not to chase after happiness, you're not going to get it. It's not going to come to you. Happiness is hard. Happiness takes work. Happiness, it's like, there's not, you can't just by accident, build a space shuttle. You can't just by accident write a book. It doesn't just happen. You actually have to figure out how best to do it. There are right ways and wrong ways, or good ways and bad ways, and you have to pursue those. And the notion that we're going to pretend we're not really interested in happiness, that's not really what we're after, and somehow, by faking ourselves out in some way, it's gonna happen. I just don't think that's really the way it goes. And I think there's nothing wrong with admitting to ourselves, we're here to be happy. That's what we want, and we're going to pursue things that make that possible. So the notion that, the more we focus on it, the less we're going to be happy, I just haven't found that to be the case.
Yeah. That's good stuff. You write about obstacles. You talk about our innate capacity to learn from them. We're able to use them to generate the very thing that enables us to overcome them, strength. And you talk about in Nichiren Buddhism, encountering obstacles is thus considered paradoxically the path to a life of comfort and ease. That kind of sounds, on the face of it, counterfactual. An obstacle, by definition, is not ease or comfort. Can you explain?
Yeah. So I mean this really quite literally, that you cannot get stronger if you don't lift heavy weights. And so you could argue the need to lift a heavy weight is an obstacle in a metaphorical sense. So when you have a goal and obstacles start arising, if you don't have those obstacles to train you, you're not going to be able to reach your goal. Real simple example. You want to learn to play the guitar. No one was born knowing how to play the guitar. There's a lot of obstacles to learning to play the guitar. Your fingers get calloused and rough. They hurt at first. You have to develop the coordination to be able to do that. If there weren't those difficulties, if you didn't actually have to challenge yourself to learn to play the guitar, if you didn't have that obstacle, you wouldn't develop the characteristics or the skills you need to play the guitar. That almost sounds like a tautology, and I don't mean it that way. But the notion is that when obstacles arise, how you approach them, even if you approach an obstacle with frustration and, I'm so annoyed that this is happening to me, I don't want to have to deal with this, but then you are forced to deal with it and you manage it. Invariably, you learn something that then enables you to accomplish your goal, even if not, or another goal. So we are forged through obstacles, right? being happy is largely about being strong, and strength only comes from challenging a strong enemy, whatever that enemy may be, whatever that obstacle may be. And so if you never challenge that obstacle, if you never learn from it and develop yourself into someone who's able to solve even bigger obstacles, it's going to be really hard to be happy.
Yeah, I just had an interview with Kyle Maynard. He's a congenital amputee. You've probably seen him on TV.
I know Kyle, yeah.
And talk about obstacles. But one of his favorite words he was saying, or favorite phrases, is "I don't know." In other words, he doesn't know his limits, so he goes and challenges himself just to see where they are.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And
that's awesome.
It's awesome. I mean, taking a phrase "I don't know" and making it something that is a positive to go for. But I came across a word that I had never, alexithymia. Tell us what that means, and its use when it comes to discouragement, because you kind of address it in the book about faltering resolve and discouragement, finding out what makes us discouraged.
Yeah. So alexithymia is a really common problem that I think estimates are 10% of everyone living on the planet has, and that is you don't actually always know what you're feeling, which seems like a strange idea that, how could you not know what you're feeling? But in fact, I experience this in my practice all the time. I have patients come in and I ask them, "Are you depressed?" And they say, I don't really know. Or, "Are you anxious?" "I'm not really sure." And I always find it puzzling. But in fact, a lot of people really often cannot tell what they're feeling. And it's a very interesting phenomenon. And sometimes it's because people spend a lot of time refusing to feel what they feel. When they do feel anxious or depressed or angry or guilty or shame or whatever negative emotion it is, they will often suppress it. And one of the unfortunate side effects of learning to suppress your emotions is you lose track of what you're actually feeling. You can't actually grab a hold of it. So I don't know if this is a particular section of the book that you're referring to, but what I find is when people, are not conscious of sort of what they're feeling and actually don't know that they're depressed, it's sort of like you can't begin to tackle the problem, which is that you may be suffering tremendously, but if you refuse to even allow that inner to acknowledge the emotions that are making you suffering, you can't begin to sort of solve the problem that's causing those emotions.
Yeah, you write about specifically about discouragement. What is to try to find out? Well, first discerning that you are discouraged. So, because some people are conflating maybe depression with discouragement,
sure.
Or and again, I don't want to speak for you, but you talk about trying to discern what is it. It may be discouragement. And if you're discouraged, then break that down to what specifically do you think you're discouraged about, and then see how can that be resolved, right? How can that be overcome? Parsing out. I think the point was isolating exactly what was blocking you so that you could take some appropriate action versus generalizing. Does that make sense? An emotion
yes, it does.
That, I give up. I'm
it
giving
does.
up.
It does. In fact, right. So in fact, it's a very interesting phenomenon. What I've noticed is that people, when they are feeling really discouraged and overwhelmed and want to give up, it's often not any one particular thing, but it's an accumulation of a number of things. So if you think about it, we all have a metaphorical plate that's of a certain size, and we can fit certain amounts of obstacles on that plate. So maybe we have one challenge at work, we have another challenge in our family relationship, we have another financial challenge, and we're doing fine until you add one more challenge than we actually feel we can handle, and suddenly you want to take the entire plate and throw it all out. And we often don't know, when we reach that point, what was it in that, all those number of challenges we have that actually got us so discouraged and made us feel so overwhelmed that we suddenly feel like we can't do anything. And what often happens is if you sort of stop and break it down and ask yourself, okay, I've got all these problems and I suddenly feel like I can't handle any of them. Was it just the accumulation of all of them together that just overwhelmed me? Or is there one of them in there that I really don't know what to do about? And I'm so worried about that I suddenly feel like I can't do anything about any of them. And so, again, it's a very simple exercise, but this really does work. When you feel overwhelmed by your life, if you sit down and you start writing down every single thing, every challenge or problem you're facing, often then what happens is you realize, wait a minute, I can handle this work one, and I can handle this family one, oh, it's the financial one. That's the one that's knocked me off my beam and made me feel like I can't handle anything. But that's not the case at all. That's where my doubt is. That's where I need, solutions I don't have. That's where I can focus my energies, and I don't have to be overwhelmed by my entire life. It's this illusion. It's a cognitive illusion that suddenly, if there's one thing you cannot handle, that suddenly you feel like that feeling expands to encompass all the other things that normally you would be able to handle, but now you feel like you can't.
Yeah. That's great. And I never thought about the generalization of discouragement, right? How it can kind of just become this amorphous blob thing versus...
well, it can color everything in your life, even things that aren't discouraging. You suddenly feel discouraged by them because you're so overwhelmed by being discouraged by even just one thing.
Can we talk a little bit about anxiety and fear? Because
yes,
you actually mentioned something from a brain health perspective, where you talk about brain inflammation and its relationship to, or how anxiety may be related to brain inflammation. And you recommend, you have some recommendations there.
Yeah, so I don't think anxiety is just caused by one thing, but there are some studies that are suggestive that people have different levels of literally inflammation in their brains that have all types of neurologic and psychologic effects, one of which is anxiety. There was a study of medical students, and it was a small study, but it was a very well done study that they looked at levels of markers of inflammation in their blood, and they gave them supplements with omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which are known to be anti-inflammatory. And what was fascinating was in these medical students who were all quite anxious, as you could imagine, being in medical school, that the ones who were taking the active intervention and not placebo had a 30% decrease in both markers of inflammation in their blood and their levels of anxiety, strongly suggesting that inflammation in the brain may have a real effect. There's been some further work since then around depression as well, that there are some folks who are depressed possibly as a result of inflammation in the brain. That's just one teeny suggestion I had, and it's not actually the major way that I recommend approaching anxiety in general, but it was a fascinating finding.
Is, just real practically, is there a certain dosage amount, or?
There is, and you know what? I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but it's in the book and it's easily findable. But it's sort of around the standard doses that people take as supplements. Now, the thing is, you got to be careful because just because you're taking them doesn't necessarily mean you have that inflammation in your brain or that your anxiety, if you have it, is caused by that. But it certainly isn't going to hurt you.
Okay. But you also have some great strategies for overcoming anxiety, and also you actually go into, and may not get it all here, but you actually go into talking about the fear of death.
Yeah.
And talk about that real briefly. What are your tips for overcoming anxiety and or fear in general?
Right.
I know some of it, you mentioned exposure, things like that. Go ahead. So
I find an incredibly powerful technique in this notion of acceptance. There are a lot of studies that show when you have an unpleasant feeling, whatever it is, anxiety or something else, if you try to resist it, invariably that makes it worse. In fact, that's the exact thing that people who have panic attacks tend to do when panic begins to rise. You are telling yourself you're too weak to withstand it and you're going to devote all your energies from running from it, which doesn't work. In fact, the fact that it doesn't work only makes your anxiety worse. You get anxious about the fact you can't stop feeling anxious. If instead you approach anxious feelings in the spirit of acceptance, you say, well, okay, there's this thing making me anxious, and I can't get away from this thing, so I really can't get away from this anxiety. I'm going to just embrace it. I'm going to allow myself to feel it. What you are, in fact, saying to yourself is you're strong enough to withstand this anxiety. And I can give you a great example of how this works in a pragmatic way. I had a friend who told me one day that he had to get an MRI to get a diagnosis of some problem he had. And his doctor had prescribed this, but he'd been unable to tolerate the MRI 4 times. I don't know if you've ever had an MRI, but it's extraordinarily... claustrophobia. People who are claustrophobic have a really hard time with it. You're like in a coffin.
It bothers me.
Yeah. So he was telling me about this problem. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do. He was taking Valium prior to get into it, as we'll give people, anxiolytics that help to manage their anxiety. And it wasn't working. And so I said, I think you're looking at this all wrong. Let me suggest when you get into that MRI tube the next time, which is going to be the 5th time, that instead of really trying to suppress and squash that anxiety and not feel it, you say to that anxiety as if it were a person inside of you, okay, bring it on. You wanted me to feel anxious? I'm going to feel anxious. Bring it on, and just let yourself feel it. Don't resist it. Tell yourself you're strong enough to handle it. And I saw him a week later, and he said, you want to hear the strangest thing? I did exactly what you said, and I got in that tube, and I didn't even feel it. And he got through it. And it's amazing because, the studies show.
Amazing.
It really is. But the studies show this is the case, that when you accept an unpleasant feeling like anxiety, paradoxically, it tends to reduce the anxiety. But it's really important to recognize that is not the reason to adopt this technique. Your goal is not to stop feeling it. Your goal is to tell yourself you can endure it. And enduring it, then you suddenly have, paradoxically, the ability to control it. When you're resisting it, all your energy is pushed, is dealing with actually resisting the feeling itself, and you're consumed by it. In fact, you're feeling it so much it often paralyzes you. But when you say to yourself, I'm going to let this anxiety flow through me, almost like a wind passing through a room, right? It paradoxically gives you the ability to look around and say, all right, I'm going to feel that anxiety, but now I'm going to do what I need to do, even if it's that very thing that's causing this anxiety, I'm going to do it. In fact, I talk about in the book about this notion of ACT, A-C-T, which stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, where by accepting that unpleasant feeling, say anxiety, you're able to diffuse the emotion from the action it wants you to take, which may be the exact opposite action you want to take. So, for example, let's say you're a young person in college and you see someone you're really attracted to and want to ask them out on a date. That's very anxiety producing for many people. And the way to avoid that anxiety is actually easy. You don't take the action. Don't ask that person out. Tell yourself you're not going to do it, and the anxiety calms right down. But then you're not able to achieve your goal. So if instead you say to yourself, all right, I'm committed to my goal, that's the commitment part of acceptance and commitment therapy, I'm going to ask this person out. And in order to do that, I'm going to accept the fact that as I'm doing this, I'm going to feel really anxious. Maybe my voice is going to shake. Maybe I'm going to sweat. But I'm going to accomplish my goal. I'm going to allow myself to feel this anxiety in service of freeing me to take the action that I need to take to accomplish my goal. And what people find is when they get really good at this, when they practice this, they get much better at it. And they suddenly find themselves able to do things they never believed or imagined that they could, because their goal is not to first become perfect and calm and confident and then take the action. It's to take the action as they are feeling not confident and anxious.
There's some kind of anxiety. I don't know where it comes from or what have you, but it's like debilitating. They can't travel long distance.
Right.
Is there clinical grade anxiety levels where this may not work, or is this something you work up to?
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because people who suffer from generalized anxiety or acute anxiety disorders where the anxiety itself is so out of proportion to what's going on, or maybe not centering around any one particular thing, but is sort of free-flowing and generalized, I'm not suggesting those people only use this technique. People like that probably need professional help, may even need medication to quell their anxiety. But even then, because most medication doesn't silence anxiety entirely, this is a technique that they can use. If they recognize, because anxiety, for example, is a signal. We evolved anxiety and fear to protect us. But then in the modern world, our anxieties are often stimulated by things that are not actually really threats to our survival. They just feel that way. And when you can identify anxiety as overblown or something that is not protecting you, it's not serving to keep you safe, but it's actually preventing you from accomplishing a goal you want to accomplish, that's the time to bring in this technique, to recognize that as unpleasant as anxiety is, it's not going to kill you. It's just you work really hard not to feel it. If you can begin to train yourself to endure it in the service of accomplishing a goal. So, for example, as you said, if you have a friend who becomes more anxious the farther from home they travel, but in order to accomplish some of their life's goals, they have to travel far from home. There's a reason to do that. This would be a great technique for them to employ. The idea is not to get rid of the anxiety, but to learn to tolerate it. Olympic athletes know this. They know this very well. You don't become an Olympic athlete without learning to tolerate the pain required to train and actually, do their sport.
What about choking? In sports specifically, is that a form of anxiety, and would this technique help?
In a sense, choking in sports probably comes from something a little bit different, which is that once you begin to observe yourself, performing the technique, your executive function takes over, and you start to perform it in a way you think you should rather than the way your body knows that you should. And what ends up happening is it is your anxiety that bounces you out of the zone, so to speak, and gets you monitoring yourself in a way. Because when you're anxious, you're incredibly self-monitoring. You sort of, you're bounced out of yourself. You watch yourself do a lot of things. And so it is the anxiety that actually that triggers the process where your executive function starts to take over, and you get in the way of the part of your brain that knows how to perform the motion better. So in a sense, yes, I think this technique would work if prior to any performance, not just in sports, but say public speaking, for example, if you're very anxious to publicly speak, the answer is not to try to quell your anxiety. The harder you try to squish it down, the greater it grows. But if you make you look at it sort of as your companion and someone who you're going to allow to sit there, but then not fight it and say, all right, I'm going to feel really anxious, but I'm going to go do this anyway. And I'm going to sit there sort of allowing the anxiety to exist, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on what I actually have to do. Often what you find is once you get into doing what you're doing, the anxiety is forgotten. It's ignored.
Mm-hmm. So it makes a case for act first, let feelings follow.
There you go. And yeah, when your feelings,
which is hard to do, but
it is hard to do. Yeah. But even being oriented along this way of thinking, there are definitely a number of goals that we have that the obstacles to our achieving those goals are purely external. But far more goals, I would argue, the obstacles are internal. We stop ourselves because as we think about what we would need to do to accomplish those goals, all these unpleasant feelings start rising up that we don't want to feel. And so we tell ourselves a story. We say, I can't do that. I can't possibly get up and perform in front of people, because what if I do a bad job? I will be horribly ashamed and embarrassed. The obstacle is the embarrassment and the shame that they're worried about feeling. And that internal obstacle, one way to actually get yourself to do what you obviously feel you want to do and you value, is to say, I can tolerate those feelings. I can tolerate being ashamed and embarrassed. And I'm going to allow those feelings to happen. And then I'm going to do what I need to do to accomplish my goal anyway. What you find is if you practice this, one, you get better at it. And two, it unleashes you. You suddenly become capable of doing things and taking on challenges you never imagined you could, when you realize the only thing that was stopping you was your fear of feeling feelings that you didn't want to feel.
This is great. I'm actually taking notes for myself here, right? So I got to go. I have 2 MRIs Wednesday for my knees, and I don't know what it is, man, but it's that being encased in this loud booming. Mechanism. It's just almost. It's coughing really with somebody with death banging. Yeah, it's like being in a coffin with death banging on the door, and dong. It's just unnerving to me. So I'm gonna use some of that advice. This has been fantastic. In fact, I'm anticipating we'll probably need to bring you back on for Q&A, because we're going to get a bunch of questions here. Dr. Lickerman, this has been fantastic. But a couple more things. So is there anything, group, tools, technologies, outside of things that we talked about, that you recommend for our listeners that maybe you've used in your life? I don't know. We talked about some of the brain health and things like of that nature. And I'm gonna try this chanting. I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna need some more. But are there? It could be methods of exercising. It could be books you've read, or anything else in this area that you'd recommend to our listeners that have helped you.
I can't, the things that really frankly helped me are not readily accessible to your listeners, which is a lot of the scientific studies that have been published. It's a real shame that they're not made more widely available to the public, because there's science out there and studies that have been done that really are beginning to illuminate the way our brains and psychology works, that are putting together a story of our psychology that enables us to leverage it in a way to work for us that just is not available to the lay public and is not widely read by even scientists. So I don't know how to.
What do you think of the resurgence of psychedelics these days? Psilocybin and microdosing LSD. Do you have an opinion on that stuff?
I do. I find that
I'm hearing some phenomenal, or reading some phenomenal stories in a controlled environment where some of these.
Yes. In fact, I'm so interested in this. This is actually going to be something I talk about in the last chapter of my current book, which is that this notion that
When is your book, by the way, when is your book coming out?
Oh, it's if I make my deadline, it's slated to come out in the first quarter of 2018.
Okay.
So in about a year.
Go ahead.
But I'm fascinated by the reports of people who have used psychedelics, both in controlled and uncontrolled settings, of the perspective and the thinking and the idea and the thoughts and the life states that arise from that. And so I think what you're referring to is some recent studies with patients who are terminally ill with cancer who've been given psilocybin in controlled laboratory conditions to help them manage the anxiety. And the very exciting initial results suggest that it has a greater effect on anxiety and a more permanent effect on anxiety than almost any other treatment we've found thus far.
That and
PTSD.
Yeah.
Right. I'm very excited to see
it's good
that we're finally going back and studying these compounds, and we haven't sort of just dismissed them as only negative and drugs of addiction that we should have.
We blacked out LSD since Timothy Leary.
Yeah.
And no scientific.
That's right.
Work.
That's right. Yeah, I think they have a lot to teach us. I think that, interestingly, one of the arguments I'm going to be making is I think they have a lot to teach us about the notion of enlightenment. I think that there is
Sam Harris writes about that. Yeah,
he does, and I actually agree with him. I don't necessarily agree that the way to enlightenment for all of us is to take LSD, but the fact that a drug like that can induce a state that, for all the world, sounds like blissful, like a joyful state. To me, the relevant point about that is such a state is possible. Now, how one would achieve that in the absence of drug use like that, and what that would mean, and how you would maintain that and actually function like that, because you can't, when you're tripping on LSD, you may be blissfully joyful, but you're also not really functional. So how does one, I'm intrigued to ask the question: can we establish a life state where we are supremely joyful, being completely connected to the interconnectedness of all things and feeling love and compassion for all things, and yet at the same time be our best selves and be completely functional? And I'm going to argue, I think you can. I'm intrigued by the notion that such a state is possible that's drug induced, and I'm wondering, how does one induce that without drugs?
Yeah, and there's and some of these changes in some of these case studies that I've read are permanent with these folks, or at least to date, right?
I think a lot of
they'll overcome some kind of traumatic memory or what have you, and their life is altered to the positive. It's amazing. It's very fascinating, like you said.
It really is. What we're learning, among other things, is that all of psychiatry is going to turn out to be neurology, and that how the brain is affected by chemicals, perhaps how the mind achieves certain insights through the taking of chemicals, and how those insights last to have a permanent effect on how we feel or don't feel, avoiding the anxiety or the stress of PTSD, is fascinating. And I'm very excited to see people doing research on this. I'm eagerly anticipating what we're going to learn in the next few years.
Yeah, me too. Very cool. Dr. Lickerman, thank you so much. This has
been my pleasure.
How do people find you on the interwebs?
On the interwebs, they find me at alexlickerman.com, or my blog is happinessinThisWorld, all one word.com.
Happiness in This World. Okay. And you're on Twitter and all the other...
And Facebook and all those other places. Yeah, you Google my name, I'm there.
Okay. Very cool. Alex, thank you very much.